Well, I'm delighted to be here with Lady Antonia Fraser to talk about her book, The King and the Catholics, The Fight for Rights 1829, all about the fight for Catholic emancipation. I suppose the first thing I should ask you, Antonia, is why you wanted to write the book.
I've always been fascinated by Catholic history. I think the fact that I became a Catholic when I was 14, a convert because my parents had become Catholics, I think the two things came at the same moment: a very keen interest in history and a keen interest in Catholicism. Therefore, putting them together, I became interested in Catholic history. And in fact, in 1996, I wrote a book about the Gunpowder Plot, which was part of that fascination, which was like a prequel to The King and the Catholics, if you like.
So having written the book on the Gunpowder Plot, did you always feel you wanted to write on Catholic emancipation?
Not explicitly about Catholic emancipation, but I didn't think I was finished with Catholic history by any means, nor do I feel I'm finished with it now. There's an excitement about it, tracing it through in our island and the island next door. And when I became a Catholic, I was sent to a Catholic convent, St. Mary's Ascot, and I met girls with ancient Catholic names, recusant names, refuseniks names, as they were called. And that increased my interest, you know, it had a sort of human side to it.
Now, you've written a good deal on the 17th century, as you said, when anti-Catholicism was a major issue. So did you see that there were parallels between that period and the early 19th century?
I think that, first of all, the mid-17th century, obviously, with Cromwell, the execution of the king, and then later, the Glorious Revolution, which brings William III to the throne, the Protestant, and expels James II, the Catholic. That's obviously a crisis in Catholicism, in which the Protestants in England say, this is our country and our religion, be off with you. So I think there is a parallel between that time and the 1820s and 30s, when the crisis rises up again, and people say, our country is Protestant. Does that mean that no one here can be a citizen unless they're Protestant? Are there no rights? The word rights is a slightly sort of dubious one, but surely people have a right to their own religion. And so that there is a sort of parallel between the two crises.
Now, the king of the title is George IV. So do you think that George IV was actually a major impediment, obstacle to emancipation?
Well, actually, there are two kings in the title. I use the king, as I say in my little foreword. I use the king symbolically, meaning the sovereign. And there are two kings, George III, and then George IV, his son, who actually ruled for him as regent after he went mad. But I think that's an important point. And I think they both had a different influence on the subject.
So what do you think the distinctive contribution of the different Georges was?
George III suddenly discovered that in order to secure the union of England and Ireland in 1801, the Catholic grandees in Ireland had been promised emancipation, a nod and a wink. They'd not been promised it officially. And he was horrified and said, this is against my coronation oath. And there are theories that it touched off his madness. One of his sons, the Duke of York, actually said, that subject made my father mad. Well, we can never know the answer to that one, but he certainly thought it had. And he said the cabinet is not to discuss emancipation again. And the subject went away for 10, 15 years.
And George IV, was he then a major obstacle, do you think, to emancipation?
George IV was a quite different character. He'd been Prince Regent for a very long time. He was also a self-indulgent character. He'd been the eldest son, and by the time of the crisis in the 1820s, when his father was dead and he was the actual monarch, he was pretty heavily on laudanum, and as well as sort of grossly fat through overindulgence and drink. And I don't think you could compare him with George III, who was in full possession of his faculties, except when he was mad, you know. And I think George IV had got a great complex about his father, and the fact that his father refused to sign up to Catholic emancipation, saying it's against my coronation oath, influenced George IV. And he said, well, it's against my coronation oath too.
Now, George IV is usually considered a slightly comical figure. So do you think that emancipation was actually a matter of principle for him?
I think we must remember that even slightly comical figures are not comical to themselves, and they can have principles, you know. I think that's very important about history. You know, we may find someone you think, what an idiot, but that doesn't mean the idiot didn't have sincere principles. So I think George IV was sincere, if slightly addled in his brain.
Now, it's a bit of a counterfactual, but late in his reign he then agrees to emancipation, and obviously it takes a while to pass through. But do you think if George IV had have lived on longer, would he have perhaps converted to parliamentary reform?
It's a very interesting question, instead of which his brother William IV took over, who had always been quite liberal, and in fact behaved, given the subject, quite well over parliamentary reform, didn't really hold it up. No, I think George IV would probably have thrown a few hysterical fits. He was a very different character. And then probably given in the end, as he did. But he wouldn't have given in to the Duke of Wellington, of course, as he did with Catholic emancipation, because the Duke of Wellington was against reform.
Now, that brings us on very nicely to Wellington's role. Now, your mother wrote a major life biography of Wellington.
Two volumes.
In 2 volumes, yes, quite right. So what do you think about Wellington's handling of Catholic emancipation?
I think Wellington's handling of Catholic emancipation is extremely interesting as part of the character of the great Duke. He married Lady Kitty Pakenham, a sort of collateral great aunt of mine, and I think that began my interest in him as a child. But I think here you get the great general who's used to devising a plan, a strategic plan, and then saying, march men, march. Now, that's all very well, but it doesn't necessarily make you a great general, and he is the victor of Waterloo, very much in everybody's minds and memories. But it doesn't necessarily make you a great politician. And I think at the beginning, he mishandled it by saying we can't have it and we must never have it. And then, luckily, his Anglo-Irish blood, Wellington was born in Ireland, his experience of Ireland, the fact that his brother, Lord Wellesley, was the Viceroy in Ireland at the time, and his experience of Irish soldiers, many British soldiers were actually Irish. All of this combined to make Wellington see sense, as I would say. And when Wellington saw sense, you had to see sense too. And at a given moment, probably after the by-election which produced Daniel O'Connell as an MP in Parliament, except he couldn't take his seat because he was a Catholic, probably Wellington made a decision then. He may have been working towards it, but he made the decision. And then he said, this is for the welfare of Britain, the overall welfare. 7/8 of Ireland are Catholic. For the security of Britain, Ireland can always be invaded by France, our enemy, our previous enemy. And he took that decision. And I think that although you can criticise his early handling of it, you can do nothing but praise him for what he did in the end.
Do you think that Wellington was the only person that could overcome George IV's opposition? There were contemporary descriptions of Wellington as King Arthur, weren't there?
Well, the king, George IV, referred to him rather spitefully as King Arthur. I don't think the king liked that, but I don't expect kings do like threats from generals.
Yeah. So why was there so much hostility and suspicion of Catholics in this period?
I think we must remember that in history we kept fighting Catholic enemies. I mean, in the 16th century there was an armada, 1588. It was mounted by the Spanish. It did intend to invade England, and they were all Catholics, you know. And these kind of things linger in folk memory. In the same way, we'd fought France frequently, most frequently in the Napoleonic Wars, of course, and they were Catholics. And then an extraordinary thing happened, of course, that during the French Revolution, religion was, to speak sort of in short, religion was abolished in France, which meant that a lot of Catholics fled from France, Catholic priests and Catholic nuns. And suddenly you get a situation where they're Catholic refugees. There's one famous scene where some Catholic nuns arrived on the seashore in Sussex, and who helped them but the then Prince of Wales, the future George IV, and succoured them and went and greeted them very graciously. So the French Revolution, paradoxically, helped us to see Catholics as not the enemy because of these refugees. And Catholic priests walked down the streets in England in their robes, which was technically illegal. As they were French, nobody did anything to them.
And do you think that was important in showing, if I say, the Catholics' fitness for emancipation, their ability to be entrusted with it?
I think that was an outward show, but I think we mustn't underestimate the power of the families, the Catholic families, who just survived and survived and survived. They went to Mass secretly. They had Masses in what they called a library, in what they called a mausoleum, you know, or an odd farm building, but they were all chapels. And there were priests who were billed as being tutors, you know, librarians, gardeners, but they were priests. They just kept going. Very often the man of the family would go to the Protestant church, you know, and the woman who was bringing up the children would go to a secret Catholic Mass. And they kept going. And there's a great deal of courage about that endurance. And I found it a very interesting subject to rehearse, the way these families, these Catholic names, survived. And that happened slowly, not with the glare of attention, but it meant that when Catholic emancipation bubbled up, the Catholics really were part of the country, in spite of the other theory that they were all horrible popish people. You know, there were two thoughts. I think we could think of parallels in our own day about people who are part of our society and we like very much as neighbours, and then suddenly we read something about them, about their government at home or about their race, and we begin to have prejudiced views which we don't feel at all when talking to them.
Yeah. What about public opinion in all this? It's sometimes said that public opinion was much more opposed to emancipation than the MPs who passed it through Parliament.
I would agree with that profoundly, but I think that is part of a constitutional monarchy. The MPs are not there to be led by the people. They're there to guide them, elected MPs. And to make another parallel from my own youth, capital punishment, which was ended, and when very young I campaigned against it. Capital punishment undoubtedly would have been favoured if there'd been a referendum. You would have continued to have capital punishment. But the MPs voted against it and it went. And that, I think, is the comparison.
So do you think that Robert Peel was important in helping Wellington deliver emancipation?
I think Robert Peel was crucial because he changed his mind at a crucial moment, did so very publicly, and really enabled Wellington to get it through. Robert Peel had been vocally against Catholic emancipation, including when he was Secretary of Ireland, which meant people thought he knows what he's talking about. And then gradually, for reasons which are interesting to discuss, he gradually changed his mind, probably affected by Daniel O'Connell's election in 1828. And on the 12th of January 1829, he wrote a letter formally to Wellington, said, "I've changed my mind, I withdraw opposition." he then offered to retire from the fight, but I don't know what you think, but opinions differ as to whether he really meant it. And I think I quote a fellow biographer of Peel, Douglas Hurd, when he said, in a decision like this by a politician, there's always an element of ambition,
Yes.
of wanting to be on the winning side.
Yeah.
And that expressed exactly what I thought, and so I quoted it. I think we can't acquit Peel of ambition in this respect. On the other hand, if a politician doesn't go for what he thinks is right, you know, that would be terrible. So the charge of ambition, politicians should be ambitious. They should be ambitious to bring about the right thing.
Absolutely.
And then he had to undergo a by-election, which he lost at Oxford, and then a seat was found for him by a deal, and back he came. So I think he was very important.
Yes. And of course that sort of stayed with him all his career, didn't it? This charge of having, as it was said, ratted on emancipation. And you quote stories like the Duchess of Rutland having stuffed rats in her drawing room and things. So it did affect him, perhaps, in terms of his long-term career.
Didn't the Duchess of Rutland have stuffed rats on her dining room
She
table?
did. That's exactly right.
Because
yes.
What fun research is, I remember spending a lot of time trying to discover whether they were real rats
yes.
or stuffed rats.
Yes, yes. In terms of his later role, do you think the experience of emancipation affected him during the Reform Bill crisis in 1832?
Well, obviously it must have affected him, and even more than affecting him, don't you think that it affected the way his fellow Tories treated him?
Yeah.
I mean, the stuffed rat has done it once, and the stuffed rat's going to do it again. I mean, I think it haunted him, don't you?
Yes, indeed. And in such a short period between the two.
Yes. 3 years.
3 years.
Yes,
Yes, exactly.
I mean, door to door.
Yes.
From
quite.
passing of one and the passing of the other.
That's right.
Two momentous things. But don't you think, although we're straying a bit because it's not in my book, but I think you know all about the Corn Laws.
Yes.
Don't you think these two events affected his
Yes,
reputation?
absolutely. The two great crises of his career, really, where they sort of, it was coloured, and his approach in 1846 was coloured, and people said, well, we should have learnt the first time. You know, this is a man that will constantly change his views, and we would say now, do the right thing, but of course to many of his followers, it was, insupportable. So there was a rhyme that expressed this opposition to Peel, wasn't there?
Yes, I love it. I quote it. O member for Oxford, you shuffle and wheel. You have altered your name from R. Peel to Repeal.
And there's a whole host of these things. I think there's one that I know that is about him being slippery like an eel, ascending through the slime. He changes his views from time to time, you know. So this charge of inconstancy was levelled at him quite severely, really. It was quite stern stuff.
To be frivolous, do we feel sorry for him having a name like Peel, which rhymes with so many
Absolutely.
things? After all, couldn't do it to Gladstone.
No, you couldn't. No, it was a godsend for rhymers. And of course, in Ireland he was Orange Peel.
Absolutely.
And then he was shown in caricatures. I think you've probably got a couple in the book or talk about them. A turncoat, so he turns green.
Yes.
So the Irish green. So there are all these sorts of lovely motifs that can be turned against him, really. But I think we have some sympathy for him between us, don't we?
Definitely.
In terms of what he did. Now let's move on to O'Connell, who in a sense was a great opponent of Peel. So you credit O'Connell with a large amount of the reason why emancipation passed. So do you want to say a little bit about why you think O'Connell was so crucial?
Well, my book has two heroes. I mean, they emerged as heroes. I didn't go to write a book about two heroes. One is Duke of Wellington, born in Ireland, and the other is Daniel O'Connell, also born in Ireland, but born in very different circumstances. And Daniel O'Connell, the liberator, as he's rightly known, extraordinary man, a lawyer, a great orator, whose pleasure was to swirl about the streets of Dublin, and I mean swirl, wearing a wonderful dark cloak. When I go to Dublin nowadays, I try to imagine how he was going down what is now called O'Connell Street. But he had a tremendous effect on his Irish supporters. He could sort of get them to do things. But the thing he got them to do, there's one thing which is going to sound little, which is he got them to give up alcohol for an election. Now, that sounds a very small thing. In Ireland, believe me, in the 1820s it wasn't. And the other thing, the really important thing, he said, we are going to have a bloodless revolution. We're not going to achieve it by violence, we're going to do it without blood. And nobody really had said such a thing in Ireland before. Irish were persecuted, they were invaded, they were held down. Naturally, they reacted to fight. And it was his determination to do it bloodlessly which enabled the whole movement to go forward. The first Catholic MP to take his seat in the House of Commons was actually a lord, a courtesy lord, the son of the Duke of Norfolk, the premier Catholic peer. And he was actually elected in the family seat, took his seat, took the new oath, which was not anti-Catholic. That was the first one. When O'Connell turned up, because he'd been elected before the Act for Emancipation was passed, maliciously, the government said, you've got to take the old oath. You've got to take the oath for which he'd fought to be abolished. And this was very wrong. I'm afraid Peel may have been responsible. It didn't help. Things were going forward. And the result was O'Connell went back to Ireland, fought a by-election, and of course won it with more success than ever, more popular than ever. He then finally took his seat, and it was a very exciting moment. But perhaps the most exciting moment was after he won the first by-election at Clare, and he addressed a meeting and said, ladies and gentlemen, you see before you something you've never seen before, a Catholic member of Parliament. You know, that was the great Dan. He knew what to do. And then, as he was escorted towards Dublin from Clare, everybody cheered and clapped him, including British soldiers. And this was probably one of the elements reported to Wellington, which convinced him that perhaps Catholic emancipation's time had come.
Now, your last two books have been on great 19th century political crises, the Emancipation and the Reform Act. Why do you think these are important moments in our history?
I think both of them had an enormous effect on our constitution and thus on our history and on our sort of mentality. I mean, emancipation comes first, and it's a great gesture of tolerance. It says people can have their own religion and be loyal citizens. You know, they can give allegiance to the Protestant monarch, even if they're popish. You know, they can fight for him as they already did. They can be MPs, they can be magistrates, they can get degrees at university. These are all things Catholics couldn't get before. Parliamentary reform obviously meant that the suffrage was enormously widened. I mean, it would seem very little to our ears today in percentages, but you shouldn't deal in percentages. You should deal in changes. And a whole extraordinary amount of people, all male of course, that's a different story, extraordinary amount of people were able to vote for the first time.
Now, we're living in a period of division over major political issues. That's probably always the case. But do you see any parallels between contemporary events and the emancipation crisis?
I think a historian always sees parallels. That's part of the fun of history. And I do believe history should be a pleasure as well as a dutiful study. I think one of the things I derive from the Catholic emancipation crisis, which I think is also true today, is the enormous importance of individual characters. this is, you might say, an anti-Marxist view. It's against the view that everything is themes which just move forward. I think the character of Wellington and the character of O'Connell and the character of Peel were enormously important in forming these events. And in the same way today, you know, we study characters and we see how the existence of one character, existence of another, some aspect of them, how incredibly important they are in affecting political events.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to speak to you about the book, and thank you so much for answering our questions.
Pleasure. Thank you, Joe.